The wind was cold that night. It touched my face like small knives. I pulled my scarf tighter and walked faster. The sky was dark, and the streetlights were soft and yellow. The world looked quiet, almost empty. It was only 6 in the evening, but it already felt like night. I had just finished work. My body was tired. My hands were cold. My mind was heavy. All I wanted was to go home. People around me were walking fast too. Everyone wanted warmth, a place to rest. I passed by a bakery. The smell of bread filled the air. It made me feel a little hungry. I thought about my small apartment. It was not big, but it was mine. It was the place where I could finally take off my shoes, sit down, and breathe. I tried to remember what food I had left in the fridge. Some carrots, a small piece of chicken, a few green onions. Not much. But maybe it was enough. Maybe I can make some soup tonight, I said to myself. Hot soup sounds perfect on a cold day. As I walked, my breath turned into small clouds in the air. The wind blew them away fast. I looked at the trees by the road. They had lost most of their leaves. The last few danced weakly in the wind, as if they didn't want to say goodbye to autumn. The city felt colder every step I took. I imagined the feeling of a warm bowl in my hands, the smell of soup, the sound of boiling water, the steam rising slowly into the air. That picture kept me walking faster. A bus passed by, splashing water from a puddle. It touched the bottom of my pants, cold and wet. I sighed and whispered, "Great. Just what I needed." But even then I laughed a little. Sometimes life was like that, cold and funny at the same time. When I turned the corner, I saw my apartment building. The windows on the top floor were glowing softly. Some people had already closed their curtains. From the distance, it looked warm and safe. I reached the front door, took off my gloves, and searched for my keys. The metal felt icy in my hands. When I opened the door, warm air from inside touched my face. I smiled. Finally, home. I hung my coat, took off my boots, and looked around. Everything was quiet. The small lamp in the corner gave a yellow light. My plants near the window looked sleepy. I went to the kitchen and opened the fridge. Yes, the carrots and chicken were still there. I nodded to myself and said, "All right, soup it is." The thought of it made me feel better already. There was something about cooking that always made me calm. Maybe it was the sound of chopping, or the way the smell slowly filled the air. I put on some soft music and tied my hair up. Outside, I could hear the wind blowing again. But inside, it was quiet. It was my little world. I started cutting the carrots. The sound of the knife against the board was steady and soft. Then I sliced the chicken and added a bit of oil to the pot. Soon I could hear the sizzle. The smell began to grow warm and rich. I closed my eyes for a second. I could almost feel the warmth of the soup even before it was done. The night was cold, but inside my heart, something was already melting. The water started to boil. Little bubbles danced on the surface. I watched them rise and break again and again. It was simple, but it felt peaceful. I added the carrots first. They made a soft sound as they touched the water. Then I put in the chicken, some salt, and a bit of ginger. The smell began to fill the kitchen slowly. The window glass was foggy now. Outside I could see the dark sky and the streetlight below. People were walking home, their steps fast and small. I felt lucky to be inside, warm and safe. I leaned on the counter and watched the steam rise. It made little clouds above the pot. I smiled. "It smells good already," I said quietly. Cooking alone was not lonely tonight. It felt like I was taking care of myself. The sound of the boiling water, the soft music in the background. They made the room feel alive. I thought about how fast the year had passed. It felt like yesterday was summer. Now winter was almost here again. Life moved so quickly. Sometimes I forgot to stop and just breathe. I walked to the window and looked outside again. The street looked colder now. The wind pushed leaves along the road. Some lights in the building across from mine turned off. The world outside was quiet, but my kitchen was bright and warm. I turned off the stove and poured the soup into a bowl. The bowl was white, a little cracked on one side, but I liked it. It was old, but it felt familiar, like a friend who stayed through every season. I carried the bowl to the small table near the window. The chair made a soft sound as I sat down. I held the bowl with both hands. It was hot, almost too hot to touch, but it felt good. I took the first sip. The soup was light, a little salty, just right. The warmth spread through my body. My shoulders relaxed. My hands stopped shaking from the cold. For the first time that day, I smiled fully. I didn't need music or TV or anyone talking. Just this quiet moment and a bowl of soup. I thought, maybe happiness doesn't need to be loud. Maybe it's in small things, a clean room, warm light, soft music, and something hot to eat when the world outside is cold. I looked around my kitchen. The shelves were not perfect. The cups were mismatched. But somehow it all looked beautiful tonight. I took another sip, slower this time. I closed my eyes and listened. The wind outside was still strong, but it couldn't reach me here. The warmth from the soup felt like a small hug. I could feel it in my chest, gentle and calm. I whispered to myself, "You're okay. You did well today." And it felt true. I finished the soup and put the bowl in the sink. The smell stayed in the air, soft and comforting. I washed my hands with warm water and felt a kind of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The night was still cold, but my little home glowed with quiet light. I sat by the window again, watching the city slow down. Somewhere far away, a car horn sounded, then faded. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and thought, maybe tomorrow will be cold too. But that's okay, I have soup. The soup pot was still warm on the stove. Steam slowly rose and disappeared into the air. I stood there watching it, and suddenly something inside me shifted. The smell of soup brought back a memory, a soft, faraway picture of home. I saw a small kitchen with light falling on the table, and I saw my mother there. She was moving slowly, cutting vegetables, stirring the pot. The same sound, the same smell. For a moment, it felt like I was back there again. I could hear her voice, calm and gentle. "Soup makes you warm inside and out," she used to say. I remember how she smiled when she said that. I closed my eyes. The image became clear. The window in that kitchen had frost on it. I sat near the table, my hands cold, waiting for her to call my name. When the soup was ready, she would put it in front of me and say, "Eat it while it's hot." And I would always say, "It's too hot, Mom." She would laugh and say, "Then blow on it, silly girl." I smiled at the memory, but then my eyes started to sting. It had been years since I saw her last. I didn't even know when I started missing her this much. I opened my eyes again. The kitchen in front of me was quiet and empty. The only sound was the soft hum of the fridge. The steam from the pot looked like a ghost of time, something that lived between now and then. I whispered, "Mom, I miss you." The words felt small in the air, but saying them out loud made me feel lighter. I walked to the window. Outside, the first snow had started to fall. Tiny flakes danced in the streetlight, slow and quiet. It was beautiful and a little sad. I touched the cold glass with my fingers. The warmth from my skin made a small, clear spot on it. Through that small space, I looked out into the white night. I remembered the last winter I spent with my mother. She had been sick, but she still made soup every Sunday. She said it made her feel alive. That smell, the same smell that now filled my kitchen, it felt like love. I took a deep breath. The air was thick with the scent of ginger and chicken. I let the warmth fill my lungs. It was like she was still here somehow, in the smell, in the steam, in the quiet night. I sat down again and wrapped my hands around the bowl. The soup was still warm. I looked at it for a long time before taking a sip. The taste was simple, but my heart was full. Maybe that's what she meant all along. It wasn't just about food. It was about care, about slowing down, about remembering love, even when it's far away. I smiled softly and a tear ran down my cheek. Outside, snow kept falling. Inside, the soup cooled slowly, but my heart stayed warm. I sat quietly by the table. The soup was almost gone. Only a little steam still rose from the bowl. Outside, snow kept falling. The world looked soft and white. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. The music from the radio played low and slow. For a moment, everything felt still, peaceful. Then, knock, knock, knock. I opened my eyes. It took me a second to understand what I heard. Someone was knocking on my door. At this hour, I looked at the clock. It was almost 9. I wasn't expecting anyone. The knocking came again, a little louder this time. I stood up, feeling a small wave of worry. Who could that be? I whispered to myself. I walked to the door and peeked through the small hole. A young man stood outside. He was holding a paper bag and looked cold. His hair was wet from the snow. His face was red from the wind. I hesitated for a second, then opened the door. He smiled nervously. "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice a little shaky. "I just moved in next door. My stove broke tonight." He lifted the paper bag in his hand. "I bought some food, but I can't cook it now." He looked embarrassed, his breath turning into small clouds in the cold air. "I was wondering if maybe you have a microwave I could use?" For a second, I didn't know what to say. He looked so cold and so young. Then I smiled. "Of course. Come in." His face relaxed, and he stepped inside carefully. He brushed the snow from his shoulders. "Wow, it's so warm in here," he said softly. "Yeah," I said, closing the door behind him. "It's warmer when you have soup." He laughed a little. "Soup? That sounds amazing." I looked at the pot on the stove. There was still some left. I turned to him and said, "Would you like some?" "It's still hot." He shook his head quickly. "Oh no, I don't want to bother you." "It's no bother," I said. "Really. I made too much anyway." He smiled, shy but thankful. "Well, if you're sure." I took another bowl from the shelf and filled it with soup. The smell filled the room again. Ginger, chicken, warmth. He sat at the small table, his hands near the bowl like he was afraid to touch it. "Thank you," he said. "I didn't expect this at all." I smiled. "Me neither." We both laughed quietly. Outside, snow kept falling, and inside, the air felt soft and golden. He took a sip and closed his eyes. "This is really good," he said. "Better than anything I've had in weeks." I blushed a little. "It's just simple soup." He shook his head. "Maybe. But it tastes like home." His words made my heart pause for a moment. Like home. Yes, that was exactly what I had felt too. We sat there, two strangers sharing soup on a snowy night, the room warm, the world quiet. And somehow it didn't feel lonely anymore. The snow outside grew heavier. Big white flakes danced under the streetlight. The world looked quiet, almost frozen in time. Inside, the room was warm and golden. The small light above the table glowed softly, and the steam from our bowls floated between us like clouds. He held his spoon carefully, as if afraid to spill a drop. "This really is the best soup I've had in a long time," he said. I smiled. "It's just carrots and chicken," I said. He shook his head. "No, it's more than that." We both laughed, but then there was a comfortable silence, the kind that feels safe, the kind that doesn't need to be filled with words. He told me his name, Evan. He had moved in last week. He worked at a bookstore downtown. His stove had stopped working that afternoon, and the repairman said he couldn't come until tomorrow. "I didn't know what to do," he said. "I was too tired to go out again. Then I smelled something really good from this side of the wall." I laughed. "So the soup brought you here?" "Maybe it did," he said with a grin. We kept talking, about books, about how cold the winter felt this year, about the little cafe at the corner that made terrible coffee, but good muffins. Our voices mixed with the sound of the wind outside. The air was soft, warm, full of life. At one point, I looked at the 2 bowls on the table, mine almost empty, his half full, both sending small trails of steam into the air. Something about that sight touched me deeply. Just an hour ago, I had been sitting alone, thinking about my mother, feeling the cold inside my heart. Now, here I was, sharing soup with someone new, feeling connected. Maybe warmth wasn't just something you felt in your hands. Maybe it was something you shared, like a story, like a meal, like a quiet evening in winter. Evan put his spoon down and looked at me. "Thank you," he said softly. "Not just for the soup, for the company." I smiled. It's nice to have someone to share it with. We sat for a moment longer, just listening to the sound of snow hitting the window. It wasn't lonely anymore. It felt like the start of something gentle, something small, but real. When he finally stood up to leave, he looked at the pot on the stove. "There's still some left," he said. "Yes," I replied. "Enough for tomorrow." He smiled, then added, "Maybe I'll fix my stove tomorrow, or maybe I'll come back for another bowl." I laughed. "We'll see." He waved and stepped into the hallway. Cold air rushed in for a second, then disappeared as I closed the door. I turned off the lights in the kitchen, but the warmth stayed. In the air, in the smell of soup, in my heart. I walked to the window and looked out again. Snow was still falling, soft and endless. The world felt quiet, but not empty anymore. I whispered to myself, "Sometimes warmth begins with a small bowl of soup." And that night, I believed it completely.